to put the best application out there possible, you specifically, I would recommend post-bac work. Ask Dr. Gray Pre-Med Q&A brought to you by Blueprint MCAT. What's going on? How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you today?
I'm doing amazing. I'm excited to find out what I can help you with. What's going on?
Yeah, so I am a fairly non-traditional applicant, and I feel like my stats are somewhat competitive for a lot of MD schools. However, I think more important than the specific number for my GPA, which is okay but not great, is the trend. And I have a downward trend, which is, somewhat lethal in some schools, I know. And so I feel as if I have a good explanation for the downward trend. I feel as if I'm able to tell my story and kind of explain that. But one thing I'm worried about is potentially coming off as if I'm making excuses rather than explaining the downward trend.
So first, let's define what your downward trend is, because I get a lot of students who are like 3.9 students and then they drop to a 3.7. They're like, oh my gosh, I have a downward trend. I'm like, that's not a problem. Right. Yeah. So what is your GPA just kind of overall?
Sure. Yeah. My cumulative GPA is 3.40.
Okay. So not spectacular, not terrible. What's your science GPA?
3.35.
Okay. So right around the same range. Yeah. And then what was the trend looking like and where has it gone?
So it's I think exacerbated even by the fact that I spent my first 2 years at a community college.
Okay. So I wouldn't worry about that part.
Well, okay, sounds good. So my worry, of course, is just that if they see I did well at community college and not so well at university, there might be some questions raised. Yep. But the freshman year GPA was about a 3.8, sophomore year about 3.6.
Okay.
Junior year, again, about 3.6, 3.7. And then senior year, 3.0.
Yeah, so that senior year is going to sting you a bunch.
Yeah.
What happened senior year?
So I am about 5 years out from college. Mm-hmm. I did not decide on medicine until about a year after having graduated college.
Okay.
So I didn't really know what I was doing in college. I knew that I wanted to do a lot of stuff, but there wasn't a lot of intention behind it.
Yep.
So there wasn't a lot of focus or motivation. So I started out kind of just vaguely wanting to major in chemistry, biochemistry, just because that's what I did well in high school. And then I was really inspired around my junior year by physics. I really got into Neil deGrasse Tyson and Carl Sagan's Cosmos series, just got super into physics. So I decided to add a physics major. And I didn't decide that until my junior year of college. So I essentially did the entire physics program, a 4 years comprehensive program in just 2 years, concurrently with my upper level biochem major.
Okay.
So I ended up double majoring in physics and biochem. A lot of my poorer grades are from quarters where I was taking, at the same time, I was taking quantum mechanics, electromagnetism, modern physics lab, genome sciences,
So you tried to become a rocket scientist in like a semester.
Essentially, not the most well thought out decision.
Okay.
And then, of course, at the same time, I was doing undergraduate research, and I was also working about 30 hours a week to support myself.
Got it. So obviously, the thing that broke was your GPA, your grades in your courses. So the question is, and that's kind of your explanation, and you're worried that it's going to come across as an excuse. And really, at the end of the day, it's a super common story of students just taking on too much and then falling behind in courses. And for you, it sounds like you weren't pre-med at this time. You didn't want to be a doctor. You didn't know you wanted to go to medical school. It wasn't until after. And so for you specifically, post-bac work is likely going to be what you're going to need to kind of just reverse that trend and get a nice little U going. So your final stats aren't going to be great, right? The 3.4, 3.35 with as many credits as it sounds like you have. You're not going to budge those numbers a ton, but you'll be able to reverse kind of what that graph looks like in terms of starting off well, coming down, 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 and then post-bac work coming back up, going, look, I was overwhelmed. And even looking at your credits, it sounds like you're going to have a crap ton of credits your senior year, that to any normal person will look at that and go, well, of course you didn't do that great. You had all these credits. And then when I look at your activity list, I also see that you're working 30 hours a week and all this other stuff. So it's one of those things where you're likely not going to have a chance to explain it unless you reverse the trend. And that's going to take some post-bac work to do that.
Okay. Thank you for the feedback. And that's something I've gone back and forth on a couple of times. I did apply 2 years ago, and unsuccessfully did not receive an interview invite. And so I
applied to post-bacs or to medical school?
To medical schools.
Okay.
And after having done that, I applied about 30, and every school that did not explicitly say in their rejection email that they do not provide feedback, I asked for feedback.
Yeah.
And, I got some very conflicting feedback from the admissions committee members that I spoke with. So for example,
so just to clarify for just people watching, I wouldn't necessarily use the word conflicting feedback. It's just different feedback, because every medical school looks at things differently, right? So to you, it's like, well, what do I do? And to them, they're like, well, this is just what we focus on.
Yeah. That makes sense, and good clarification. Is it okay if I name the schools from which I got the feedback? Yeah. So for example, Dartmouth was like, your academics are not a problem. You're totally fine. You've shown competency. And I think part of that was my MCAT score.
Okay.
Maybe I know that you repeatedly harp on, it doesn't save a GPA. It's just one additional part of the application.
Yep.
But Dartmouth specifically was like, we don't have any concerns there. Case Western, on the other hand, was like, we very much would like to see some additional coursework.
Yep.
So it is unfortunately school specific, and it's maybe hard to know what each school will think before having the chance to apply to them, of course, and getting that feedback. But you think a post-bac is recommended?
I would, right? Just in the broadest strokes. And that's why I don't get super specific. And well, this one school wants this and this other school wants this. I talk very generically, right? Of to put the best application out there possible, you specifically, I would recommend post-bac work to reverse that trend. Because the last thing a school wants to be concerned about is your level of commitment to doing well in medical school. You started off great, and yes, in terms of community college for you, there is that concern of community college where you did well, and then you got to what many perceive as harder courses at a 4-year university, and then you struggled. Medical school is just going to add another level of complexity onto that, and are you going to struggle more? And so nobody wants to cross the finish line stumbling and falling down, which is what you've done in terms of just your GPA. And so Case Western, I think appropriately, is like, hey, like, I'm concerned that you're just going to be laying flat on the ground when you get here, and you're not going to want to do all of the hard work necessary to continue or to pass medical school, regardless of crushing the MCAT. Right? Great. You can do well on standardized tests. There's still a lot more work that goes into medical school than just doing well on standardized tests. So that's the concern, I would say, across the board. So random schools like Dartmouth apparently don't care. Did they interview you?
No, they did not.
Yeah. So to me, I would take that recommendation with a grain of salt of like, your academics are an issue. Well, if they're not an issue, invite me for an interview. Obviously, the application is much broader than that, right? Stats, again, are just one part of it. You have all of your experiences and everything else and how you talk about those things as another part. So from an extracurricular standpoint, what kind of things have you been doing to get into the med school mind?
Yeah, well, of course, there was my full-time work in college, which is, I think, a big part like what defined my college experience, and is what originally drove me into medicine, I think, just because I was working at restaurants full time. But one of these restaurants actually had a huge emphasis on community service to the point where they were offering free meals to anybody that needed one. And this was in a really low income neighborhood specifically. So a huge portion of our clientele were, people of low income. A lot of them were houseless or unhoused. And so, being in that environment and having the opportunity to serve those people was what really originally drove me to pursue a service-oriented profession. But then, since then, of course, I needed the clinical experience. So I started shadowing and I volunteered. But I volunteered in a child life capacity, which I think is great. But as I've come to realize, it's really not sufficient by itself.
Yeah, and I don't understand that, right? I love child life. I have a child that unfortunately has procedures in the hospital every couple months, and we interact with child life all the time. So as a parent, right, I love child life, and I think what child life people do is 1,000% great clinical experience. But then you can talk to admissions committees, and they're like, "Oh, child life is just playtime with kids." I'm like, "No, it's not." Like, you ignorant buffoon. Like, go actually into the hospital and see what it's all about. But anyway, that's just my personal take.
Yeah, I mean, I felt as if it gave me some really great perspective, and I had the opportunity to develop some really meaningful relationships, not only with children but also their families.
Yeah.
But c'est la vie.
Yeah.
So on top of that, I didn't have a ton of clinical experience. And so that's where I was at when I applied last time. And I think that was a big weakness in my application.
Yeah.
And since, right after I got rejected is when COVID started, which made it a little bit difficult to address that weakness. And so I have been working, my job title is team coordinator at a cancer hospital.
Okay.
And in that capacity, I'm able to work very closely with physicians, meet with them every week, go over the care plans for each individual patient. I get to interact with the patients and develop these really, I think, cool long-term relationships with them, which has been a great experience. And being able to witness the patient-doctor interaction has also been a really cool thing. So it's really only, I think, affirmed my decision. It's just, hoping to frame that and also this worry about whether or not it will be sufficient, right, without the post-bac.
Yeah, and I think the key asterisk on there is without the post-bac. So my assumption is that you're in the middle of another application cycle now.
Yeah, full disclosure, of course. I have submitted my primary, and I am imminently going to submit my secondaries.
Okay.
It's early August.
Okay. Fingers crossed. My gut tells me not the best move, but it's only time and money at the end of the day. So in the interim, I would also go sign up for some more classes and see if potentially even maybe updating the schools to say, hey, I'm also taking some more classes, may be a spark enough for them to go, well, let's continue to talk to you and hopefully see how you do in these new courses as well. But I think it sounds like the position that you have now is really interesting, where you are interacting with patients, you're talking about clinical things with them and what to do. It sounds potentially like it's mostly, and maybe I'm wrong, but more telemedicine based. Is it directly interacting with them as they're in the clinic, or is it through phone calls and stuff?
It's mostly through phone calls, although we operate on kind of a rotational basis. So I'm every couple of weeks in the clinic and interacting with the patients and saying, a lot of it is like scheduling their appointments, but a lot of it is also just making sure that they understand what they need to do for appointments. So, for example, any restrictions prior to imaging or prior to any sort of procedure that they're having. So being able to actually speak with them in person, meet them in person has been one of the more rewarding parts of the job for sure.
Yeah. My fear with that position is you have your child life, which a lot of people goes, oh, that's just playtime. This other position potentially sounds a little bit more admin based and not necessarily clinical based. And so you may get the same kind of issues. Although COVID, compared to last cycle, COVID may potentially be a silver lining to to say, well, there really wasn't a lot I could potentially do in this time period. But my gut again tells me, number one, grades, and then number two, again, a little bit of that lack of direct patient care, quote unquote, taking care of patients, to give you that experience. And it's when I say that, it's not to check off a box for the medical schools, but it's to be able to reflect upon the right experiences so that your personal statement makes sense. And when you answer, why do you want to be a doctor? That makes sense. And when you reflect in your activity descriptions, those all make sense about, like, I understand who you are and why you're doing this, especially given the path that you have, being a non-traditional and coming to this world a little bit later. And I would say that your whole kind of journey of working in the restaurant industry and having this service-oriented mindset kind of imprinted into you, whether you had it before but just grown through the restaurant industry, I would say that's even more of a potential question mark, because to me, there's no direct line between I want to do something in the service industry, I'm going to be a doctor. Because being a doctor, yes, is service, but there are 1,000 other things out there. And it's just this random like connection that you made of like, I wanted to give back, therefore I want to be a doctor. And that's, to me, that doesn't make sense. And that's where you're going to have a harder time, especially given the lack of true clinical experience potentially, to draw those conclusions for the medical schools.
Yeah, and that's great feedback, and I mean that's definitely something I'm going to have to address at some point. So it's great to hear it from you specifically.
Yeah, and so potentially, hopefully, you never have to write another personal statement. But if you need to write another personal statement, working with someone to actually craft that story. But hopefully you get some interviews. Really making sure that you're doing mock interviews to hone that story a little bit more, to draw those connections better.
Yeah. Well, without getting too terribly into it, but a big focus on my personal statement and my motivation for medicine is specifically this opportunity to be a resource for people, to provide a resource to people. So, one thing that really struck me throughout my entire time just doing what I've been doing is how one thing affects another, right? The intersection between somebody's access to healthcare and somebody's access to food, to transportation, how it's all interrelated. And I've really found that healthcare is one of the most foundational aspects of somebody's well-being and how they're able to just thrive as a person. And so just being able to provide what I feel is a really foundational resource is kind of at the center of my motivation to pursue medicine.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
It does. For me personally, when I read a story like that, I'll say, you don't know what being a doctor is all about.
Sure.
Which
is fair, of course.
And that's where the exposure hopefully is there. When I look at activities, and maybe you didn't talk about it well enough in your personal statement, and then I'll go to look at your activities and go, okay, you have plenty of experiences. Let's invite you for an interview and hash through this a little bit more.
Yeah.
Because the biggest fear for medical schools, number one, is that you're not academically capable, right? Because you need to pass medical school. Right. But number two, that you don't really know what it's like to be a doctor or truly want to be a doctor. You just have this theoretical, I want to give back, kumbaya, and medicine is what I want to do. And then you get out into residency and out into your clinical rotations in third and fourth year, and you're like, oh crap, this is miserable.
Yeah. No, that's fair, and it's certainly not a situation I would want to be in as the person doing it. So I mean, it's obviously I'd be doing myself a disservice not to really, be completely sure of what I'm doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, briefly, just assuming that I am able to express myself maybe a little bit more eloquently or effectively than I have, and I'm able to get an interview and go ahead with submitting this cycle. One thing that's currently holding me up is an old letter of recommendation, and I don't know if this is something that I should allow to hold me up. So I have about 6 letters of recommendation at this point.
Okay.
About 3 of them are from the previous cycle, and I've had 2 of them redated for the
Okay.
current year at the recommendation of several schools. And one of my state schools specifically requires letters dated for the current year.
Yep.
One of the professors I am really just not able to hone in on and get them to redate the letter. And I assume I'll be able to eventually, hopefully within a week or two, but I can't be sure of it. Do you feel as if I should just go ahead and submit my application with an old letter, or should I wait a couple of weeks and in the hopes of being able to submit it with all current letters?
When you say submit your application, what part of the application are you talking about?
The secondary, so the whole thing.
Yeah. So the secondary application, I wouldn't sit on because the dilemma is, especially if you've already been requested to write the secondary, right? The school has said, hey, thanks for applying to our school. Here's your secondary application. If you're just sitting on it, waiting for this potential letter of recommendation, then the concern is going to be, well, you're just not interested in our school because it took you a month and a half to fill out our secondary.
To be totally clear, I've been verified. I submitted to one school, and so I'll be submitting the primaries just to all the schools and assigning these letters as soon as I have them finalized.
Got it. Yeah. So I would potentially wait in that case, right? If you haven't added the schools to the list yet, especially for schools that kind of quote unquote require or highly recommend that the letters be dated the same year, I would give it another week or two.
Okay. Great. Well, I think that's probably all the questions I have time for, but I really, really appreciate you taking the time to sit down with me.
Yeah, no problem. Fingers crossed. Good luck to you.
Thank you. All right. Have a good one.